I'll be talking about hornbill movements and seed dispersal patterns in southern Cameroon. This was my dissertation research at the University of California, Los Angeles. And I'd just like to start by acknowledging all of the talented people who made this research happen. I will be offering some acknowledgments at the end again, but uh, this involved several students who were involved in the research process, from generating questions all the way through writing publications, and were really the driving force behind this research, many of which I think are going to join the call. So I will acknowledge them again at the end, but just keep this in mind as I speak. The main idea behind my research is the interactions between vegetation structure and animal behavior. So one way that vegetation structure influences animal behavior is by indicating energetic costs. It can also indicate predation risk for animals. But animals also influence vegetation structure through their ecological roles. Some examples include seed dispersal and herbivory. So this sets up a natural feedback loop in terrestrial ecosystems that I argue is important for ecosystem functioning. Things like the distribution of vegetation in space and time, how vegetation stores carbon, and how ecosystems can harbor biodiversity. My dissertation research focused on some components of this feedback loop involving seed dispersers in a Congo Basin rainforest. Now, the setting for this research was the Jah Faunal Reserve in southern Cameroon. It is the largest protected area in the country, and it's home to over 300 tree species, the majority of which are dispersed by vertebrates. So, as you can imagine, animals have an outsized impact on the vegetation structure of this region and this protected area in particular. So here is a drone image that gives you a sense of what the landscape looks like. It is covered mainly by tropical lowland rainforest. It's mature, has never been logged. But some of the other main habitat types include Inselbergs, which are rocky outcrops that rise above the rainforest. That's what you're seeing towards the center of this image. And in between these Inselbergs are swamps, swamp habitat. And so these are the main habitat types that if you were to go to the Jah Faunal Reserve for the first time, you would notice. You would also notice the hornbills flying overhead and in the canopy. They are large, charismatic birds. They're very loud, and they are very important for these ecosystems. So the two species that I focused on were black-casqued hornbill and white-thighed hornbill. They go by many names. Some of the local names include Mango and Duo for black-casqued and Kata and Dam for white-thighed hornbill. Together, these two species disperse about a quarter of tree species in southern Cameroon. I should also mention they are the largest fruit-eating birds in these ecosystems. Another reason that they're important and interesting is that they undertake long-distance movements during the major dry season in Cameroon. So they are obligate frugivores. They need to move long distances in search of fruits, all the while dispersing seeds. That brings me to the main questions that my research sought to answer. First, how does vegetation structure affect hornbill habitat selection? I also wanted to know how hornbill movements affected spatial patterns of seed dispersal. And the final question that I'll talk to you about is how do seasonal movements influence seed dispersal beyond protected rainforest areas? Now, we needed to track hornbills, and this involved the need to capture them as well. So we used a technique called a canopy mist net. It is mounted in the canopy using a pulley system. And we described this technique in a recent paper, which I'd love to refer you all to. But the fieldwork process was to first capture hornbills, then we attached GPS transmitters using a backpack harness, and we were able to successfully capture 16 black-casqued and 5 white-thighed hornbills. I'm very pleased to say that all of the hornbills are alive and carrying tags that are functioning and still transmitting data, which I think is really terrific. And we download these data either on the site where we captured them using a handheld base station, or when the birds leave the Jah Faunal Reserve, they encounter an area of cell network coverage and are able to send the data through cell networks. Now, our first question was how vegetation structure influences hornbill movements. For this, we needed data on the 3D structure of the rainforest. We use light detection and ranging, which you can think of as a type of 3D scanning technique that gives you a 3D picture of what rainforest vegetation structure looks like. And from this LiDAR data, we derived metrics such as canopy height, vertical complexity, and distance to canopy gap, things that we thought might be important to hornbills. And we related hornbill GPS tracks, hornbill movements to these vegetation structural metrics. At this point, I'd just like to acknowledge the work of Dokas and Shom, who's a PhD student at the University of Bamenda in Cameroon, who at this point has collected the majority of the GPS data on site from these hornbills. So thank you, Dokas, for this. Now, we assessed habitat selection by hornbills using an integrated step selection analysis. This analysis works by comparing the observed movement steps of hornbills, and by movement step, I mean just the straight line distance between GPS locations. So we compare the observed movement steps to randomly generated movement steps, which represent available habitat. So this is the structure of the model. At the end of each movement step, we measure our habitat variables of interest. In our case, it was canopy height, distance to canopy gaps, vertical complexity, just as some examples. And on the left side of the equation is where we're estimating the probability of habitat selection. And on the right side of the equation is our hypotheses, essentially. So what we're after is these beta coefficients, which represent the strength of selection towards each of these habitat variables. And what we found is that hornbills generally prefer taller canopies. On the y-axis of this figure, we have the individual ID of each hornbill. On the x-axis is that beta coefficient of selection for canopy height, which is a part of the integrated step selection analysis. And white-thighed hornbill has typically exhibited stronger selection for canopy height. There are a couple of exceptions here, including one bird that was a juvenile that dispersed from the study area and another whose home range was near the research camp, which was a little bit lower canopy height. But this was one of the main findings of our research. And this is just to give you a visual of what this relationship looks like. So each of these black points are GPS locations of a male white-thighed hornbill, the one in the upper left part of the screen. And you can see how these GPS locations cluster around some of the tallest trees in the landscape, and how this bird seemed to be avoiding areas of lower canopy height, such as the region in the lower right part of the screen. Now, interestingly, we also found that some hornbills of both species will select areas closer to canopy gaps, while some will select areas farther from canopy gaps. And it's for both large canopy gaps and small canopy gaps, that split seems roughly 50-50, which is quite interesting. What this means is that in populations of both black-casqued and white-thighed hornbills, there are some birds that are specialists for canopy gaps and some that are avoiders. So the specialists include birds that have a home range that includes or is near Inselberg habitats, like the one that I showed you towards the beginning of the presentation. And a reason that a bird might like to be closer to a large canopy gap is that maybe some of its preferred fruiting trees are abundant in producing fruits near those canopy gaps. However, a reason that hornbill might like to be farther away from canopy gaps is kind of intuitive. They are arboreal species. They need places to perch. They need places to find fruits and nests. So this is just to show the individual variation that we observed in how hornbills select habitat. Now, given this information about habitat selection, we also wanted to know how hornbill movements would affect spatial patterns of seed dispersal, kind of predicting that ecological role in time and space. Now, this is the workflow of that research. After quantifying hornbill habitat selection, we then simulated hornbill movements following a fruiting tree visit, and these simulated movements were based on both the habitat selection and movement behavior of the hornbills. And then along the length of each of those simulated movements, we predicted the probability of a bird essentially pooping out a seed with time since its visit to a fruiting tree. And these gut passage times of seeds were estimated from a previous study in which a former student in the lab that I worked in um, performed experiments where she and field assistants would would feed hornbills fruiting tree species and then actually uh, measure how much time it took the seed to pass through the gut. So, really grateful for all the information that we had here. This is kind of a zoomed in view of what one of the main products of this research was. This is a seed shadow produced by black-casqued hornbill after foraging on Mysopsis eminii, which is known locally as londo. And a seed shadow is essentially just the radial pattern of seeds dispersing away from the crown of a parent tree. The gut passage time, or GPT, in this image is about 289 minutes, give or take. And what you can already see is that seeds can disperse far from the parent crown and towards areas of greater canopy height. Now, the third question that I wanted to answer was, how do seasonal movements influence seed dispersal beyond protected rainforest areas? So the research and the results that I've shown you so far were for a more limited region that we were able to characterize with 3D LiDAR data. But hornbills were traveling much farther than the study area, over which I answered the previous two questions. Here's a visual of what this looks like. Your eyes might be drawn to the animation in the right part of the screen. You can already start to see that there's quite a bit of variation in where hornbills are going during Cameroon's major dry season. So there were some hornbills that flew long distances to the northeast of the Jaw Faunal Reserve, over 100 kilometers. And for folks from the US, that is 60, 65 plus miles that they were flying. But there were also hornbills that flew directly south of the Jaw Faunal Reserve in search of fruits. So there is a lot of variety that we were observing in hornbill movement decisions. So one way that we characterized this behavioral diversity among hornbills was by characterizing movement syndromes. So a syndrome or behavioral syndrome in a general sense is based on a suite of correlated metrics that help explain variation among individuals in a population. So this is research that is in progress. It's published in my dissertation, but not peer reviewed yet. So some of these results might be subject to change, but I'm still excited to show you what we're finding so far. So we are finding that there are some hornbill individuals that fly the longest distances. And interestingly, it seems to be along a more northeastern route away from the Jaw Reserve. There are other hornbills that use home ranges more intensively. If they fly longer distances, it's still much shorter than hornbills of more long distance movement syndrome. And these syndrome characterizations were based on principal components analysis. Now, given this information about variation among individuals in terms of movement behavior, the next step was to predict patterns of seed dispersal based on these behavioral syndromes. And what we found is really interesting, that the behavioral diversity of hornbill movements can also lead to diversity in seed dispersal strategies available to the trees that are dispersed by hornbills. So in this figure, we're seeing the same type of seed dispersal model that we talked about for the second question. But this time, the simulations are based on particular behavioral syndromes. So There was one scenario involving all of the birds tracked in the study, and that was the scenario with the greatest diversity in both distances and directions of seed dispersal events. And in scenarios involving birds of syndrome 1, which you can think of as our long distance seed dispersers, though that was the second most diversity in movement distances and directions. But uh, for seeds to disperse in a variety of distances and directions, we also need what I think of as cultivators, hornbills that will use a smaller area more intensively. And you can think of as cultivators of a smaller region. So that's what we found for movement behavioral syndromes 2 and 3, which are quite similar. Syndrome 2 moved a little bit farther than hornbills of syndrome 3. But what we're finding is that within populations of both black-casqued and white-thighed hornbills, we're seeing variation in movement behavior that leads to diversity in both the distance and direction of seed dispersal events. So why might this be important? There are areas of Congo Basin rainforests that are in need of seed rain from hornbills. And so some of those regions include areas affected by logging. This is also some work in progress, but something I wanted to still talk to you about because I think it's really interesting. We are using this seed dispersal modeling framework to try to predict the probability of hornbills dispersing seeds into areas that most need this seed dispersal service by hornbills. So what you see in this image in green is the contextual area affected by logging. This was based on some high resolution optical imagery from the Planet satellite system. And there's not that much I can tell you about it so far, other than hornbills typically avoid areas affected by logging, but are still visiting canopy gaps and potentially helping these forests heal from logging operations. So now we know the context in which hornbills are moving, and we have the model that we can use to try to predict how forests will recover based on seed dispersal by hornbills. Now, this idea, brings us back to the original concept that I presented at the beginning of the presentation, how vegetation structure influences hornbill movements by indicating habitat quality, and hornbills also can influence vegetation structure by where they disperse seeds. This is important for how ecosystems are functioning. An interesting ecological question, but what I'd also like to talk to you about is, in a more applied sense, why this is important. So one thing I haven't talked to you about yet is the importance of swamp habitats in this region. So we've talked about forests a little bit. We've talked about Inselberg habitats. What about swamps? Why are they important? We found that black-casqued hornbills tend to prefer swamp habitats over other types, and they increase that preference for swamps in hotter temperatures. So this is interesting because swamps, which are dominated by the palm species Raphia monbatorum and then some other Raphia palm species, they have standing water year-round or nearly year-round, and they might be acting as a cool refuge for black-casqued hornbills to visit during hotter temperatures. So what this means is that Raphia palm swamps are likely to be very important for the future range of black-casqued hornbills as climate change brings greater temperature and precipitation extremes to the region. Now, interestingly, we found that white-thighed hornbill tends to avoid swamp habitats. They will still eat some of the fruits. They still need to collect mud for their nest cavities. But white-thighed seems to be avoiding swamps. And we're not 100% sure why, but some hypotheses include that white-thighed hornbill might be a little bit more limited in the number of fruits it's able to take because raffia palms have larger fruits that black-casqued hornbills can access. White-thighed might have a more difficult time accessing those fruits. And also that black-casqued hornbills are behaviorally dominant at fruiting trees. Just one example of this is that black-casqued hornbills will often chase white-thighed hornbills out of fruiting trees if they want to access that resource. So it's possible that this behavioral dominance could extend to selection of habitats that are cooler and potentially, with denser vegetation that um, keeps them farther from predators. Now, that's just about half the story. Hornbills are also dispersers of raffia palm seeds, and probably the only major long-distance dispersers of raffia palm. And raffia palms are very important for rural livelihoods in southern Cameroon. As you can see in this photo from the village of Nkolekul, this is a shelf made by a craftsman, made entirely of raffia fronds and parts. And you can see some of the dwellings in the background that have palm thatched roofs. So uh, what I like to say is that hornbills can build a village in the sense that they are important for dispersing raffia palms and increasing genetic diversity of palm populations, and raffia palms in turn are very important for as building materials and for rural economies. Now, uh, as you can imagine, our hornbills went far and wide, and this village of Nkolekul, which is one of our partner villages in this research from both research and outreach, um, there was one hornbill that we tagged that visited the community forest of Nkolekul about 12 kilometers away. So this just reinforces the importance of doing community engagement in tropical forest research. Uh, Animals travel over landscapes that are, increasingly human impacted as sustainable development occurs. So I'd just like to finish by talking about the importance of involving communities in tropical forest research and um, how this can help conservation and sustainable development go hand in hand. Now, I'd like to again thank all of the people who made this research happen, including the Republic of Cameroon for permission to conduct this research, the several guides and eco-guards who contributed to this research. They include guides from the indigenous villages, indigenous Baka and Bajwe villages who shared their knowledge of the rainforests with us. So we're very grateful for that. And as well as the many students who are becoming conservation leaders in this country and are doing terrific work in ecology, evolution, and conservation. I'd also like to thank many funders who made this research happen, and just end by saying I encourage you to go do research in Cameroon on the fascinating fauna and flora of these rainforests, and to hire these people to do this work. They are very knowledgeable. And at this point, I'll just finish up by acknowledging again the several students who have contributed to this research, many of which are on the call. And I suppose at this point, I will also thank you for listening.
Je vais faire la traduction en français maintenant. Alors, sa présentation de Nick Rousseau, qui vient de l'Université d'Harvard, était très dense. Alors, je vais essayer de résumer du mieux possible. Il a présenté du coup son projet Kalao, où il a étudié le mouvement des Kalao et leur rôle dans la dispersion des graines au sud du Cameroun. Il a commencé par introduire du coup comment la structure de la végétation et de la forêt influençait le comportement des animaux, dont les oiseaux, et comment à leur tour le comportement de ces oiseaux influençait la structure de la forêt, cette sorte de relation qui va dans les deux sens, et comment cette relation, du coup, elle influence le fonctionnement de cet écosystème. Donc, son projet était situé dans la réserve de Dja, au sud du Cameroun. C'est une forêt tropicale. Et dans cette forêt, les calaos sont très importants pour la dispersion des graines, parce que 22% des espèces d'arbres sont dispersées par les calaos. Donc, dans son étude, il se focalise sur deux espèces, le calao à casque noir et le calao à cuisse blanche, qui sont les deux plus grandes espèces d'oiseaux frugivores dans la région. Donc, pour attraper les calaos et les marquer, leur attacher à un émetteur GPS, ils ont utilisé des filets japonais de canopée, enfin, du coup, qui étaient montés avec un système de poulies et attachés au canopé. Et du coup, ils ont après pu capturer des calaos et leur attacher des GPS. Ils ont attrapé 5 calaos à cuisse blanche et 16 calaos à casque noir. Ils ont aussi caractérisé la structure de la forêt en utilisant la méthode LIDAR. C'est une sorte de scanner laser. Je ne sais pas s'il l'a utilisé sur un drone ou sur un avion, mais il y a différentes méthodes de faire ça. Et avec cette méthode, on peut avoir la hauteur de la canopée et la complexité et calculer les indices de complexité de la végétation. Ensuite, il a analysé le mouvement des calaos euh, avec une analyse assez poussée pour voir où c'est que les calaos se déplaçaient en relation des endroits qui étaient disponibles pour les calaos, mais qui n'étaient pas utilisés, les endroits qui étaient, on va dire, évités par les calaos. Et avec cette analyse, il a pu modéliser du coup la préférence des calaos. Et son analyse a démontré que les calaos préféraient les endroits de canopée haute, donc plutôt sur les grands arbres, euh, mais que certains individus, pas tous apparemment, aimaient aussi bien les trouées dans la canopée, donc des zones avec des arbres plus bas. Euh, mais la majorité, il a vraiment montré une carte où on voit que les données GPS de Calao étaient concentrées sur les grands arbres. Donc après, il a regardé le potentiel des Calao pour la dispersion des graines. Donc il a fait un modèle où il a pris la carte d'habitat utilisée par les Calao, calculée avec les analyses des données GPS. Il a pu simuler leur mouvement sur cette carte et en utilisant le temps d'ingestion des graines, enfin le temps que les calaos utilisent entre l'ingestion et la déjection d'une graine, on peut prédire en utilisant leur mouvement où c'est qu'ils vont déposer les graines, donc leur potentiel de dispersion des graines. Euh, Ensuite, il s'est focalisé enfin, il nous a parlé des mouvements saisonniers. Certains individus font des mouvements assez importants, jusqu'à plus de 100, ils se déplacent jusqu'à plus de 100 km au nord-est de la réserve, mais c'est très variable entre les individus de Calao. Certains se déplacent beaucoup, d'autres très peu. Il appelait ça les syndromes sa présentation. Du coup, il essaie un peu de comprendre, mais c'est un peu du travail en progrès toujours, comment cette variabilité dans les mouvements des calaos affecte la dispersion des graines. Ensuite, dans son projet, il a essayé d'identifier les zones dans la forêt ou dans cette région qui bénéficieraient le plus de la dispersion des graines de calao pour savoir comment les calaos pourraient contribuer peut-être à la restauration de ces habitats. Et à la fin, il parlait aussi que les calaos, surtout le calao, enfin uniquement le calao casque noir, pas le calao à cuisse blanche, ils visitaient aussi les zones de marécage, surtout quand il faisait chaud. Et là, j'ai pas tout bien compris, mais je crois qu'il arrive à disperser une graine de palmier. Enfin, j'ai pas bien compris si c'était un palmier ou un autre espèce d'arbre qui s'avère être très important pour les communautés locales. Et après, il est revenu du coup un peu à synthétiser en miroir avec ce qu'il disait dans son introduction. Du coup, vraiment, il a démontré ces liens entre la structure de la végétation, le comportement, donc les mouvements, etc., des calaos et comment ces liens influençaient le fonctionnement de cette forêt, l'écosystème de cette forêt tropicale.